Well, hello there, Seamus.
Hi, Bruce.
It seems we're here again, and with a guest again.
Yeah, we've got Matty back on the show. Hey, Matthew.
How you doing, boys? Long time no talks.
Yeah, it's been basically years.
Yeah, like less than 12 hours.
Yeah,
Yeah, but knowing how we upload podcasts, you like it could be ages.
it could actually legitimately be several weeks.
Awesome. Keep it. Eager anticipation.
Our Canadian friend from across the pond, oh, you've come to visit us again.
Absolutely lurking in the corner on the other side of the ocean there. Yeah,
And,
no, I'm in a new location as well. I moved my recording studio from the bedroom closet to my storage closet, so I'm back in the place I like to call
So
Maddie's
what you're
corner.
saying is you're in the closet. I mean,
I am in the closet. Yeah, it's a little hovel, I like to call it. My podcasting hole.
The cave, the grotto.
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, the shrine of podcasting. But all right, do you want to tell everybody about your podcast again, just before we kick off? Some people might not have listened to the first episode.
Yeah, for sure. Our show is called Semi-Intellectual Musings, or Semi-Intellectual Musings if you're from Canada or the British Isles, as I learned. I host that with my good friend Phil Primo, and it's a social science, arts, and humanities podcast that kind of is not that academically serious, but we like to say the research behind each topic is quite serious, but our delivery is kind of laid back and off the cuff. So,
Whimsical.
yeah, so you can kind of whimsical, as Phil likes to call it. So you can find Semi-Intellectual Musings wherever you find podcasts, and you can find our social media handles all over the place as well. We'll just leave it at that and get into the topic.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about archaeology and ancient societies and history, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, this is a topic I haven't never studied formally or anything, but I have been just reading about since I was 10 or 12, pretty much. And I believe Matt has actually quite a bit of extensive knowledge about these topics, so we're going to get into it.
Yeah, I'm totally looking forward to it, boys. This is something that I did as an undergrad, archaeology. And like I bounced around a lot in my undergrad. My undergrad was like I don't know, 9 years long or so. I really Van Wildered it, but I took archaeology and ancient civilization studies, so classics is what they call it over here, for a good 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 years in there. So I got a lot of undergrad experience in it, and I figured, I don't know, it's like something I don't get an opportunity to talk about a lot on our show. It hasn't come up, and it's always been a sneaky fascination of mine. Just like you, Pierce, I study, or not studied, but I've been interested in ancient civilizations and watching documentaries and specials on TV about it ever since I was a kid, way back. So I'm really excited to talk about archaeology and ancient civilizations with you guys.
Thanks, Matthew. So much.
Phenomenal. So I suppose where to start? I have always been obsessed with the Roman Empire, in particular. I'm not entirely sure why Rome captured my imagination. I think it might be to do with the fact that there are so many parallels. It's a very cliche thing to say, but there are so many parallels between Rome and the modern Western society, especially because so many of our models of how we construct society is just based on how Rome did it.
What are some of the obvious parallels that you see? Maybe just make some connections, rapid fire.
So obviously a big one is towards the end of the empire, Christianity became the main religion, and Christianity is still the dominant religion in the West. I mean, it's the Roman Catholic Church, so that's a big one. There's also in terms of up until very recently, maybe up until the mid 20th century, the whole idea of empire building that Britain and France and even America to some extent were engaging in was pretty much modeled on how the Romans did it. And the idea of having civilization here, and then we wouldn't describe it as barbarity, but I suppose what the 20th century people would have described as barbarity in countries outside of the West, and also just even the political systems. I mean, the apathy and kind of scorn in which we hold our rulers is very Roman, especially in terms of how they view the Senate and how a lot of us would view our various politicians. And also potentially the slow saunter into oblivion that we might be partaking in right now.
Yep. Okay. That'll do. Well done, sir. Okay. So I wrote based off of those. Yes, a round of applause. Throw a sound effect in there. So the Judeo-Christian factor. That is, when it comes to Rome, that's actually the area that I do know a lot about. But by and large, Roman history and civilization for some reason never grabbed me. I would always be the guy like looking at Egypt, or like, hey, what was going on in India at that time, like those sorts of things, or Mesoamerica. But I'm interested in like getting into Rome a little bit with you both. So let's just start with Judeo-Christian ideology. I wrote as just one word that comes off of that. It permeates all of our society, right? Whether it's our political systems or social dynamics, Judeo-Christian norms and assumptions and morals and values is all throughout Western civilization, I think.
Yeah, it's. I mean, many would argue that it's the the foundational principle, I suppose, upon which, say, the Enlightenment emerged. Obviously, the Enlightenment was a rejection of certain more archaic Christian values, but yeah, as well as you said, it permeates is probably the perfect word for it. I'm not sure if I can describe it any more than that. It influences how we think about individuals, how we treat individuals, the way we think about the law, everything. In terms of how we construct our society and how we treat others. Even if you're not a Christian per se, it does influence your thinking.
And even if you're a rejectionist, okay, if you say like, I don't want to be part of that, like that is predicated on like the Judeo-Christian traditions, right? So you actively choosing not to be part of it is still based on it, right? Because it's a counterculture that's completely invented from that thing existing. So of course it has that influence as well.
Yeah, I was going to feed you that one there, Seamus.
You don't need to.
No, I'm glad you went that way, because, and also you see in the Enlightenment time, there was people who rejected sort of like more outright, so that would be one extreme. Then there was people who fully went the other direction and doubled down on religion. And then all through the middle is what you actually saw was people trying to make these new ideas fit in with the old worldview of Judeo-Christian principles. So I think that's a really interesting connection to kind of draw out here.
Yeah, I mean, we should also talk about the Judeo-Christian traditions changing as well with new worldviews, not just people adapting their views and trying to see if they could fit the old views in, but also the old views changing. You know, like the church accepting the world is round and so on and so forth, the progress to try and keep up with the change in society.
And even the disestablishment of the church, like the established church, the formal institution during the Protestant Reformation. That was what led out of this sort of questioning. But I mean, Christianity and Judeo-Christian principles had a long run. Like good, like what, 1,000 years, like 1,500 years towards in Europe. So that was a pretty healthy run in terms of civilizational standards. Another thing you mentioned was empire building, and I think related to America, the United States. The term that came to mind was manifest destiny, and I think the Romans definitely had a sense of manifest destiny, and you can contrast that a little bit with the Hellenistic civilization, the Greeks, who were more of a city-state society or a civilization, so they'd fight within the borders of Greece, whereas Rome, very quickly, once they established themselves, spread out and started taking over. So I was wondering, either one of you guys wanted to like make some connections with the United States?
Yeah, well, I guess so. The whole Roman thing is, the legionaries would have seen themselves as the sons of Mars. So yeah, they really believed to the very core that it was what they were made to do. And obviously there was like, certainly at the start, less so. During the later parts of the empire, just because it had grown so big, there was like ideas of racial superiority, which is similar to how manifest destiny worked in the 1800s. Right. All of that kind of stuff, and yeah, it was certainly an expansionist state. I mean, I think that just naturally happened because of how Rome, just because of its origin myth, and also the circumstances in which it emerged. So it would. Straight away, as soon as Rome emerged as a power, they were doing battle with the Etruscans, and as soon as the Etruscans were done, they were doing battle with Carthage, and so it's kind of almost like they stumbled into expansionism, and then it ingrained itself in their culture, and by the time they'd finished off the Carthaginians, it was just a Roman part of culture that the empire does expand, or the Republic at that stage.
Yeah, it's really interesting as well. The expansionism was also predicated on their gods being better than other gods.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. Like it's completely different kind of religious mindset now than it was then. It's like, okay, your god doesn't exist now, right? But back then it was like, oh, the Egyptian gods exist, our ones are just better, like.
Yeah.
And they're fighting in the sky, and we can understand that they're there. That's why they had accepted like all sorts of gods, and then Christianity came in. It's like that too, like it was just one god then.
And I guess if you're going to compare it to the United States, the parallel there would be that America also was kind of born of conflict. It was a revolutionary state, and I guess that kind of mindset just seeped into the populace, and it was a colony as well. So expansionism was just built into its very nature. So first of all they expanded west into the native lands, and once they hit those borders, all the other major powers were empire building at the time, and they had this expansionism just built into their character. So naturally they would.
And economy, they couldn't stop expanding because otherwise they wouldn't have enough resources.
Yeah, well, especially in terms of Rome. Yeah, Western Rome had to expand because they would just run out of gold otherwise.
They had to feed the machine.
Pretty much, yeah.
And there's the arrival of Violet, my beautiful daughter. Can you guys hear her in the background?
Yeah.
Say hi to Violet, everybody. Hi, Violet.
Hi, Violet.
How's it going?
She's turning 1 year old on next Wednesday. So whenever this drops, that will be July 12th. So very excited.
Yeah, well, happy birthday. And what's her take on the expansion of Rome?
Well, Violet believes that the idea of racial... She wanted to build off your idea of racial superiority as being the justification for expansion. And she also wanted to build on our previous conversation where we talked about a little bit about the fear of the other in relation to immigration. So I think if you put those two ideas together and then combine it with the idea that like Mars, the god, is superior or the top of the hierarchy, like Roman society was very hierarchical, and we can see basically since then in Western civilization that has been the dominant social organizing model, is hierarchy, right? And I don't think that's any more different than like having a strong man or a strong woman as a head of your tribe, as like a bunch of hunter-gatherers, is just a more complicated form of that. So it's interesting that as humans we need somebody to lead us, it seems like.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're tribal by nature, right? So it's built into us that you would elect some leader or something to just make the decisions for the tribe, and the Roman take on this is actually certainly the Republican Roman take was kind of interesting on this. So obviously those kind of tribal loyalties and ideas get a bit muddied when there's huge populations like today, or say in the city of ancient Rome, because you feel less connected to whatever leader has been elected or whatever. But originally in the Republican era, Rome had proconsuls, and they were usually elected. They were effectively dictators, but they were elected when a period of crisis came about, and they would stay in power until the period of crisis was done, was finished with. And that was the way they kind of organized society for a good 300 years before Caesar finally became a proconsul and then became dictator for life instead of just once he resolved the crisis. But so
well, you know what, man? That's actually that's like pure Marxism. What you just described there? No, just just in the sense of having a leader temporarily, and then the leader leaves, and it's more of a diffuse kind of hierarchy rather than like a top-down sort of model. Is you have like a council of people, I imagine, who all have various roles. That's Marxism in its purest form, not communism, but like the philosophy Marxism. That's what he argued. Was that like after the revolution the leader would step back after the hierarchy's got the society organized, they'd step back. Now what we obviously can see through history, and that's why studying history is so fascinating, would you give up dictatorial powers?
No,
probably not.
No, I mean I would, because I'm an angel, but you guys already seem like monsters, so of course you wouldn't notice. But like, who would give away absolute power? But then I think another point you raised there, Pierce, about apathy and scorn, like how there was
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
extremes in Roman society. And I was wondering if, like, perhaps Seamus wants to make a connection, but I would call that polemics. And I think our society right now, like, and I'm talking our society, like Western civilization, I suppose, is very polarized. You're either on one team, blue team or red team over in America, or but we have very extreme views on things. So I was wondering if we can draw out some parallels there.
Well, I think that's existed always, right? It's just it's a self-defense mechanism. It's a tribal one to kind of polarize yourself against the other tribe because, all right, you don't know who they are. You don't really want to find out, but you know they're going to take your resources and their fruit and your women or whatever it is, right? So you need to have that built in to fight yourself off. Now, it stopped becoming about resources, and it's manifested itself in the 21st century as like an ideological scorn, which is really interesting, really new. But I'd say, yeah, it very much exists, very much has a huge impact on how we live, and it really stops people from allowing themselves to understand other people's opinions and ideas. They don't want to hear anything else. You know, they're in their own echo chamber with their own group, and that's easy. But it's easy, and it's the way they like it. So.
And Pierce, do you think, like, was there a time in Roman history where, like, a change happened and it started getting way more polarized, or was it throughout and it just sort of bubbled up more extremely at certain times?
Well, I mean, it's virtually, you know, it's if you include Eastern Rome, it's almost it's over a 2,000-year history. So yeah, there was the ebbs and flows, but I think the obvious one is the rise of Julius Caesar, because he's the one who finally collapsed the Republic. He technically never became an emperor; he was a dictator for life, and then his heir Octavian, who became Augustus, was the first emperor. But there was at the time of before Caesar's reign. There was it's weirdly I do find it weirdly similar today. So wealth was accruing more at the top. That seems to just be a natural thing that over time wealth accrues towards the top rather than the bottom
like
of society.
The 1%.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be because of corruption, or that can literally just be because of competence. Like the competent people rise to the top and keep making money, that kind of thing. But anyway, so there was the triumvirate, as it was known, which was between Julius Caesar, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Pompey, and they were the three most powerful men in Rome. And they kind of vied for power, and the people of Rome at the time were very put out with the Senate because it just hadn't been effective at all. Kind of similar to how, I guess, when you
like
draw,
the American Senate,
right? Yeah. Or you could even draw parallels to pre-World War II, where the European governments were just totally failing. Especially the German, especially the Weimar Republic, in terms of trying to fix whatever issues the country had. But yeah, so and that was the culture or the atmosphere in which Caesar rose. And I do see, not to be extremist, I don't think it's anywhere near as bad. I don't think we're about to fall into some mad dictatorship, but I do see parallels where there's a type of rampant populism which can become dangerous if it's not held in check by, I guess, moral values or some mild ideas of, at least valuing intelligence or, some kind of high moral status instead of just electing whoever's the most popular candidate. Like the thing about Caesar taking over Rome is the people wanted it. It wasn't as if democracy fell in Rome because Caesar came in and brutalized everybody. The people were largely in favor of it, and I could see potentially some Western societies going that way again if we're not careful.
And it's interesting, the emphasis on critical thinking and rationality, and that makes me again think of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, right? Where you can see when you think that people were literally being enlightened and they started like critically analyzing the world around them, and that's why you see science, like the natural philosophy, turning into science, is people are just bringing rigor to their observations. Now, if you're a ruler at that time, say a religious monarch, that would be pretty damn dangerous, because you don't want people critically analyzing the world around them, because they might look around and be like, why is that guy in charge? And why is he wearing that silly crown and those stupid robes? I want that. And you just started having peasant revolts, right? So a lot around the Protestant Reformation, there was like peasant revolts for like 100 years leading into it. But also there's other factors that lead to the downfall of civilizations that go beyond like the political. And I'm thinking of, the Black Death in Europe. And what you see after the sort of 100 or odd years of the sweeping plagues across Europe, afterwards, times were actually really good for the working class, like the peasant. There was just a huge demand for their labor, so wages actually went way up, and that was the first crack in the religious monarchs, I would argue, in Europe.
Right, yeah, I have heard that's potentially what broke feudalism.
Yeah, I think so. Because then, like, you just don't have enough serfs to work the manor's land or whatever, and then when you don't have them under your thumb and can lord over them financially and militarily, that's how it leads to. But I would say that led to the development of the printing press, because not only are you being paid more, your labor is more demand. That means you have more leisure time as well. So you have more time to maybe like, you know what, I'm going to learn how to read. And this guy Gutenberg over here, he's got this wine press that got turned into a printing press, and I'm going to go pick me up a Bible. So the first things that were printed on the Gutenberg printing press for the first 100 odd years was just Bibles. And then people are like, after 80 years of that, they're like, you know what, man, I'm getting sick of reading the Bible. So they started doing other things like Grimm's fairy tales and stuff like this, because people are like, they started demanding leisure. And again, that's another threat to the establishment, the power hierarchy, right?
Right. Yeah, recreation, self-imposed learning.
Exactly.
Rather than the Roman technique of bread and circus, right?
Exactly.
Circus, yeah.
Yeah, they now choose what they can choose as entertainment, right? We're not just given mindless stuff. There was actually a really interesting revolt in ancient Rome as well, with the peasants, the plebeians, who revolted because they were being fed too much lobster.
Yeah.
It was all they were being fed. I don't know why. Like, obviously we idolize it now, but like back in the day, because they're just easy to catch, right? Yeah. So they're easy to feed. The people went and they just had a revolt because they were just being fed too much lobster.
Literally, the slaves had a revolt because they were pissed off because they were eating too much lobster.
That's hilarious. And I think of lobsters as sea cockroaches, right? So, but on the east coast of Canada, lobster fishing is huge in the maritime provinces, right? So you can go to Nova Scotia, for example. That's where it's really big, and get really inexpensive lobster. But my friend, who's from New Brunswick, told me that when her father or mother was at school, in grade school, kids would make fun of them because they had to eat lobster sandwiches, because it was thought of as bottom feeding. Bottom feeder, right? Now it's just like they changed the perception. So you even see, here's a connection. Bam, bringing it around, Maddie. You could see a connection even in Rome. Like, as they were expanding, they get access to these sort of foreign markets, right? So all of a sudden you're probably drinking beer from Germany. You might be getting wine from like Carthage or something. Maybe over in Gaul as well. Like, you're drinking like beautiful French wine. And there's other things so you see like the bread and circus, as you say, right? And then Marx would pick up on this later with the opiate of the masses, right? Like,
right, yeah.
He would say religion is that. Many people nowadays would say like our phones are the opiate of masses. Yeah, technology. And I would argue that you're going to see, you heard it here first, folks, the next sort of soft revolution that you're going to see is what I think I'm going to call the neo-Luddite revolution. And I think it's going to be people who are afraid, like I am, we covered this on the last cover, of artificial intelligence and like the Internet of Things and Internet 2.0. I don't think you're going to see people with sledgehammers smashing up things, because like I guess you'd have to break into like a mainframe in like Arizona or something. But I feel like there's going to be some pushback, because if you study, like I did, archaeology, and Pierce, like you have a long-standing interest in it, you can see these ebbs and flows and these accelerated moments and then the pushback, and it's not like it's hampering progress. It's like checks and balances, I think. I don't know.
Right, yeah, and
go on.
yeah, well, I think it'll be interesting to see in terms of nations, which nations overwhelmingly, embrace the technology and which ones don't. Like, for instance, I think here in the West, it's most likely that we will just, and probably I suspect in, say, Japan, South Korea, China, that whatever technology comes will be embraced, and that the Luddite movements or neo-Luddite movements might be there, but they will be overwhelmed. But I could see potentially in countries, I don't even know why these particular countries spring to mind. I guess just the cultural character. But say Russia, I could see a serious rejection of some of the technological developments that are coming down the line.
I disagree with that. I'd say Russia would be very open to technological progress, just because they're rejected by the Western world. So if they made technological progress, they'd want to flaunt it off.
Well, that's an interesting point then. I would say the Russian elites would be interested in technological progress. I'm not necessarily sure that the people would be.
Yeah, okay, but like think about it in terms of the space program, right?
Right.
That's a huge technological progress, and that everybody, including the elites and all walks of Russian life, were proud of it.
Right.
Or were proud to be Russian, and not because they like themselves invented the technology. It's just because they did before the Americans.
Right, but the space program isn't taking your job as a taxi driver, or it's not, it's not beginning to decide what you should eat every day because it knows your health better than your doctor.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, guys, but it did at that time in the Soviet era, like in the 50s. For one, the Soviets didn't develop that technology. They poached a whole bunch of scientists with the Americans right after
the Germans,
right after World War II. So the American program I believe was called Project Paperclip.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the Russians was called Eraser or something like that. But basically, they snagged. It was like a scientist mad crab, and that's why they developed that so quickly. And that's also why people who don't know that history, and this is why knowing history is important, I think, another example of why. Most people who don't know that history will say, oh, well, that's because aliens gave us that technology.
Right.
That's how we got to the moon so quickly.
Most people who don't know that? Yeah. Are you sure they won't just be like, oh, I don't know, I'm not going to, but they jump to aliens?
I listen to a lot of ancient alien sort of stuff, so we can get into that world as well.
Alex Jones is all in on that stuff.
Oh, if you hate Alex Jones, I do, and many others do, I highly recommend you guys and your listeners go check out Knowledge Fight. It's a podcast that is entirely devoted to tearing apart Alex Jones, one episode at a time.
Is that name like a piss take of InfoWars? Is that the idea? Knowledge Fight?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it's a great show. Yeah.
That's a good point. Just to go back onto it about the misrepresentation of history, and how that can affect society as it moves on, right? So if a society believes that these guys are the bad guys and stuff like that, and then their philosophy, the winning side's philosophy, is adopted, and the other side is demonized, you don't really get the good parts from it. Even though it could be a terrible philosophy, it's just especially nowadays it's harder to do that because all the operations and war and stuff like that are written down. But back in the day, if your king won, that's it. Who are the other people? They're
gone.
Beasts. They're just slaves now.
Yeah,
they're subhuman.
And you see, that's one of the points. I'm glad you returned to it. It's one of the points I wanted to bring up as well. When I knew we were going to talk about this last night, so racism in antiquity, so racism in the past, that's always been present. We can come up with numerous examples, but it's all over the place, right? But I think what's kind of interesting is in, say, the 1980s, in archaeology, there is what was called the postmodern turn, right? And really briefly is one aspect of it that I wanted to talk about is the kind of critically examining our own disciplines. And this turn happened in anthropology at the same time, and happened in sociology basically at the same time, and other disciplines. They all started critically looking at their own disciplines, right? And what archaeology found was that the vast majority of archaeological findings are embedded with bias and some subtle racism, if not the early stuff, which is overt racism. So in archaeology in the early times, the late 1800s leading into the 30s to the 40s, I would say, they were still ranking civilizations based on their perceived development level. So the early era of archaeology was more like gentlemen collectors, so sitting in libraries, and they'd have dudes like probably the three of us who go on a wild trip to Africa, and we just collect as much stuff as we can, and we send it back to him, and he looks at it and acts smart. So that was like, it sounds pretty sweet, right? But those people who would go out and collect, those are the ones that actually became eventually professional archaeologists, right? But as you can imagine, a gentleman in the late 1800s is going to be racist as hell, right? So that was the discipline for a long time. It was like, these people are more developed because their spear points are more finely designed or something like this, like arbitrary markers. But what I think is kind of interesting on a deeper, more philosophical level, and this is where more of a postmodern take is, like, when you look at archaeology at any time, how we view the past and who is kind of included in it and who and what kind of things are emphasized is really interesting to look at. So if you have those questions in mind when you watch your next archaeology documentary, that's a pretty interesting way to have a fresh look at it.
And just out of interest, Matt, do you have any particular civilizations that you see parallels? Like, I'm talking in terms of, like, maybe particularly ancient ones, because I think, say, civilizations from the 1800s, the parallels are pretty obvious because those nations still exist.
Yeah,
but do you have any particular ancient civilizations that you would think that you personally, besides Rome, would draw parallels to now?
So, so short answer, every single one.
Right.
Yeah, you can draw parallels with all of them. That's what's so endlessly fascinating about the study of history in general, right? But, like, I'll kind of attack it this way. Like, when I went into archaeology, later in your undergrad, you start specializing. So, and I always had it in my mind that I was going to be a university professor. That was like my number one goal. So I was like, I'm going to grad school, so I'm going to need to, like, specialize a little bit in year 3 and 4. So because it was the mid-2000s, there was 2 wars going on in the Middle East. I'm like, I'm going to study Middle Eastern archaeology and religious studies. And that was offered as like a double major, basically, at the University of British Columbia. And I studied that with that thought in mind, that if we can know the past, we can understand the present and maybe affect the future. Like, I had that grandiose utopian idea. And I think a lot of that was naivete. But I originally got into archaeology, and my interest in Middle Eastern archaeology and religious studies really was born out of, like, trying to answer some of the political questions that were going on at our time.
Yeah, that's actually a really nice view to have going into your subject. It's like, that's something people forget, I think, as well, that we can regress. Or maybe we don't even have to have a regression, just who we are and how we live today. We could always take positives from past civilizations, you know? Like, there's been, like, hugely open and progressive societies and cultures in the past that we could take and technology from, stuff like that, but it either has been lost, like, we can't get it back, like at a Greek fire, or we just have to relearn, you know, the social, like, idiosyncrasies. And
the line in archaeology, and it's based on no fact, but it's basically true as well. But 99% of the archaeological record has been lost. So we're dealing with the 1% of what was remaining. And usually that's digging around in garbage dumps. And those are the most fascinating things. So some modern archaeology and by modern archaeology, I mean in the last, like, 200 years, like that kind of frame. That's what they call modern archaeology. Is digging around in old landfills that have had a park built on top of it. But you dig down and you're like, holy cow, you can just go through the sedimented layers, and it's a fascinating trip through time. And what's interesting is the last 200 years, I mean, we got, like, photographs and like, people are writing in English, and it's not even hard to understand English. It's just a little old-timey, right? It's a little charming. We have a lot of material from the last 200 years, but it's a unique perspective you get from the material culture. And that is the thing about archaeology, is that they study the material remains. So it's just whatever's left behind. And it gives you, just this very unique perspective into the past.
Fantastic. Well, actually, there was a question I wanted to ask you as well. Obviously, you were saying a lot of your college work and university work has been in anthropology, and I think those two topics often get kind of not even confused, but people would think of them as almost the same thing: anthropology and archaeology, as in terms of when you're talking about history. So, do you have any differences that you'd like to define there?
Yeah, so like the proverbial cocktail party kind of situation, like nobody knows what cultural anthropology is, like nobody.
Right. Okay, man.
So, like, and so I've gotten really good at like breaking it down, but basically archaeology is the study of the past through material culture, and cultural anthropology is working with people who are alive right now. So I go around and interview people and then make observations of the world around me and observations of the interview when it's happening. Those are some of the finer details. I'm sorry. She's done with breakfast, it sounds like. Hey, bye. So that's like the short answer, but the kind of longer answer, and I'll keep it brief though. There's 4 fields in American anthropology, slightly different in Britain and Europe, but there's 4 fields in American anthropology. There's linguistics, there's cultural anthropology, and that's what I studied in my grad studies. There is physical or biological anthropology, and that's people who work specifically with like human remains, so it's like forensic anthropology, or botanical remains, so pollen remains. They'll analyze seeds, stuff that are like stuck to the inside of a pot. Those are physical anthropologists. And then there is just straight archaeology, and that is like a catch-all for anyone who digs in the dirt and analyzes the stuff they find. It's more sophisticated, obviously, than that. Modern archaeology, they use ground-penetrating radar and aerial and satellite, imagery and stuff now. So it's interesting that, to me, I think biological, physical, and archaeology are the 2 most scientific of not the social sciences, but they're pretty damn scientific. Like, they're very close to science. But the findings of them, the connections they're trying to make, those are the social scientific dimensions.
Right.
So they're all studying culture, but it's through different means.
Yeah, people would say the social one and the cultural one is very kind of subjective. You're choosing an opinion. You're almost theorizing every time, And
right.
People would like that's definitely not a bad thing, right? But it has a huge overlap.
Oh no,
with psychology, right?
It's the most important thing to notice when you're doing anthropology. So social anthropology, what you call it, that's just what people in Britain, or like the British Isles, that's what you'll refer to as basically cultural anthropology. Now there's divisions between those two where people will get into shouting matches in the bar next to the hotel where the conference is being held afterwards, but that stuff is not important for this show. It's not interesting enough to people who didn't. I don't even find it terribly interesting. So, but in a nutshell, cultural anthropology, like American anthropology, is a little bit more like fluid and like, hey man, whatever. And social anthropology, or British anthropology, is a little bit more structural. And they put a little bit more emphasis on like structural linguistics, so syntax and semantics. But I would say it's a kind of interest. Sorry, I didn't even remember where we were going.
Yeah,
I actually lost my train of thought.
And we were asking you, the main question was the difference between archaeology and anthropology, and maybe how they coalesce as well.
Yeah, and also maybe just what you research in your time as well in university.
Oh yeah, right. So I was taking, as I said, like ancient Middle Eastern archaeology and religious studies, and I actually just ran out of upper level classes to take, and it would have been like 2.5 years of taking like 2 classes a semester to finish my requirements. And I'm like, oh damn, I really want to go to grad school, and I met this awesome chick named Mel, and I think I'm going to marry her, and I'm like, I gotta get this thing done. Right? Yeah, absolutely. That's the lovely Melanie, and I'm like, basically anthropology is where it all transferred over. And then when I went into Anthro 101, it's a little cliche, but I was like, oh my gosh, guys, why didn't somebody tell me this discipline existed? I've been looking for cultural anthropology, but I did not know what it was, just like everybody else in the world, it seems. So as soon as I went into Anthro 101, I was like, this is my discipline. This is awesome. So I took like general anthropology. I had to learn all the theory and methods really quick within like a year and a half before going off to grad school, right? So my research in my master's was on concussions with athletes, right? And what I did for my research was interview athletes, just very much like a podcast, and who had 2 or more concussions, and then interviewed medical professionals, so doctors and also like therapists who treat athletes with concussions. And then I also tacked on a media analysis to that. I used this social theorist named Stan Cohen, who developed this idea called the moral panics model. And I did that for my media analysis, and then I also did what's called a reflexive approach. So my main methodology was actually my own concussion experience. So I'd bring that forward in interviews, make it super subjective, as you guys say, and use that actually as a research tool. It allowed me to get closer to my informants, who I only interviewed for like 1 hour, and they're just one-off interviews, and they're all strangers, right? So I found deploying my experience kind of. Sorry, she's like laughing.
No worries.
Yeah, no. This is actually really, really interesting about concussion.
Yeah.
Very different than the topic we started off on. Maybe we could discuss it in a different podcast. Actually.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe.
If it's what your grad research was on, I mean, it probably merits an entire podcast, right?
Yeah, and I want to go play with Violet right now. Like, she's making cute sounds, and I'm just like, I'm losing my train of thought and everything. Yeah, but yeah, no, I could talk your guys' ears off about concussions anytime. And honestly, like, the last like 12 hours has been an absolute blast for me. I'm so glad I met you guys. I love your show, by the way. I am a huge fan. I'm your super fan, by the way. And I really enjoyed chatting with you guys. So anytime you want to have me back on, we could talk clearly about anything. So
absolutely, man.
Well, just let fly.
Before we sign off, I would just like to ask, as somebody who studied history,
Sure.
I want an exact date here. When do you think the sea peoples will re-emerge and destroy Mesopotamian and Mediterranean civilization once more?
So I would peg that like Eric C. Klein, and I know you know who that is.
Yeah,
to 1177, because we talked about this last night. But yeah, I think the Sea Peoples were Phoenicians. I think they actually did not come from like Syria, Lebanon sort of area.
Quick explanation.
I think they came from Gibraltar. I think they're Africans. Yeah, no, I got a lot of theories. We'll pick up on the Sea People next time.
Yeah, I mean,
but when they're coming back,
is like. There seems to be a recording in pretty much a lot
Bronze Age history.
Yeah, Bronze Age history of people just coming from the sea, like not on boats, like from the sea.
And just laying waste.
Yeah,
to
like
all
Swamp
of,
Thing or whatever, just
civilization.
emerging. Like, yeah, and I think it's never a round number. It's not going to be 2020, but it'll be like 2023.
Whenever they
2023, that's when the
2023.
We have it here confirmed, folks. Batten down the hatches. If you live in Italy, Spain, Morocco, anywhere around there, Israel, get ready.
April 17th.
April 17th.
Anywho.
Alright, Matt, always a pleasure. Sure, at the end of the day, it's night.
If you were sick, you wouldn't be well.
Talk to you now.
Talk